Welcome this evening for our Antelope Valley Audubon program presentation. We're very excited that we have our little living legend that decided to retire to the Antelope Valley to look at all of the birds in the Antelope Valley. So Kimball will be talking about building field identification skills in the Antelope Valley. And he's going to look at some of our issues that we face when we're birding in terms of species that have the edges of their ranges, such as coastal species, meaning desert relatives, or the lower elevation limits of mountain species, and the southwestern limits of many wintering species. So as a birder myself, I do have problems with a lot of those overlapping species. So Kimball was the ornithologist for the bird collection at the Natural History Museum in Los Angeles for many years, and has written many books and field guides, and has a tremendous amount of knowledge about birding. So I feel like we're going to have a special treat. Let me introduce Kimball Garrett.
Thank you, Carol. Actually, the talk evolved a little bit since the blurb that you read. I cut some things out because I figured 3 hours might be too long. Anyway, no, I've enjoyed speaking here before, and previously it was pretty general, just some 10 or 20 really cool birds in the Antelope Valley. But I thought today we would talk more about specifics of bird distribution in this area, because it is such a crossroads of so many different kinds of regions and areas and ecologies and so on. And the biggest lesson having to do with bird identification is this concept of status and distribution. We think of when you want to identify a bird, you've got pictures in the field guide, you might have a recording in Berlin telling you what it is or something like that. So you think of what it looks like, plumage, colors, shapes, behavior, what it sounds like, and that's all important, but it also has to be looked at in the context of what is expected to occur where, because that really needs to factor into your identification. I mean, it's like the old saying, if you're in the American West and you hear hoofbeats, think of horses, not zebras. Zebras are a lot less likely than horses. Likewise, you may settle in on this bird looks kind of like it might be a canyon towhee, and then you look up in the books and you notice, oh, canyon towhee's never been found in California. Maybe it isn't a canyon towhee. It might just be the more common California towhee. So we're going to talk a lot about kind of distributions. Oh, I can change it with this. So good. Otherwise, I thought I'd have to sit there and face away from you. This is much better, but I will get out of your way. So yeah, I morphed the title a little bit of what we call a geographical crossroads. So, since we have a bird here, maybe we'll ask people, what is it? And if you don't know, that's perfectly understandable, because this is not a very common bird here, and it's not a plumage that you see it in very often either. So how would you go about even thinking about what it might be? You'd probably look at some of the characteristics. Okay, it kind of looks like a songbird. It doesn't look like a hawk or a duck or an ostrich or something like that. So one of those songbirds, the beak is kind of not conical like a finch, not super thin like a warbler or a wren. In fact, it's a little broad at the base, and most of our birds with kind of broad-based, flat bills are flycatchers. Those are really handy for catching insects. So this actually is a kind of flycatcher. But then you think, okay, well, it looks a little beat up, but it's streaky underneath. How many of our flycatchers around here have streaks underneath? Well, if you're just used to adult plumages, none of them actually. And in fact, even among our flycatchers, I think this is the only species in which the juvenile is streaked underneath. Our other flycatchers, like kingbirds and astrophids and westerns and willows and things like that, and wood pewees, the juveniles are plain underneath. So there's only one flycatcher we have that's streaked underneath. This is a juvenile vermilion flycatcher. It's not very vermilion. But, if it turns out to be a male and it grows up or gets into adult plumage, it will be shockingly vermilion. This is a juvenile, probably a juvenile female. This is one that was hanging around the Piute Ponds along Evidence Sea a couple years ago. Right by the spillway there. So that's kind of the thought process. Now you think, okay, well, we've decided to vermilion flycatcher. Is that allowed? Are they here? And it turns out, yes, they are. They're uncommon, but they're more common than they used to be. This is a bird that's actually expanded its range. They've now bred in several areas around the Antelope Valley, whereas 30, 40, when I started birding 50 plus years ago, if you want to see a vermilion flycatcher in California, you went to Morongo Valley. There's a little park right outside the preserve there that was usually a pair of vermilion flycatchers. And for whatever reason now, they've really expanded their range, and we see them pretty wide. So let me see. Can I do that? But actually,
Okay, Jason, but it was working.
okay, well, let me try this. There you go.
Well, it should work.
Actually, I'll sit down right here.
If you want to stand off the
No, that's okay. I'll do it right here. If I start trailing off, let me know. But my voice is too loud. It's a small room, so I think we can handle it. So, again, I just want to emphasize that we use this term status and distribution a lot, which is basically where a species occurs and when, where it's expected to occur. And you always want to keep that in mind when you're settling on an identification of a bird. So, status, and it also takes into account how common versus how rare. So you might be in a place where the species is known to occur, you might be the right time of year, but it's super duper rare, so it's still not very likely you'll see it. Whereas other species may be very abundant. So this is what I mean by a geographical crossroads. You know where the Antelope Valley is in this picture, that little triangle. It says AV, I just cheated and put that there to help you out. But really, the Sierra Nevada and its adjacent ranges form the northern border, like the Piutes and Tehachapi's and all that. And then the transverse ranges form the southern or southeastern border, the San Gabriel Mountains, and then all the mountains around Mount Pinos and those areas at the far west end. And then we're not very far just over the hill from the Central Valley, the southernmost part being the San Joaquin Valley. And of course, we're the extreme western extension of the Mojave Desert. And we're really not that far, unless you take the 14 freeway, and it takes you 3 hours from the coastal slope on the other side of the mountains. So all these areas have their own unique combinations of bird species. And yet we're in an area where most of these distinct regions virtually come right together. So you make, not all these birds from the mountains and the coastal slope will necessarily be in the Antelope Valley, but you don't have to go too far to get to where they are. So we really are at a crossroads here, and it means lots of interesting things can turn up. We also know that there's some spectacular areas to watch spring migration of birds, not too far from us here. So we get a lot of migrants from March, April, May, especially late April, and through much of May, coming through the Antelope Valley. Tanagers, warblers, flycatchers, vireos, all sorts of things, swifts, swallows, and so on. But we've now learned in the last few years that there's some areas where these migrants really concentrate. So Butterbreast Spring up off Java Canyon to the north up here is a famous area for spring migration of birds. Not only common birds that come through in big numbers, but rarities show up there all the time. And then Bear Divide to the south of us, which is kind of in the western San Gabriel Mountains, up above Santa Clarita, up above Paso Rica Canyon, that area, has been just a famous area over the last few years for large numbers of migrants in spring that come through early in the morning. So from dawn, for 2-3 hours after dawn, you may see on peak days several thousand warblers, tanagers, grosbeaks, buntings, vireos, all these things flying by, and often flying by right at eye level as they go over the pass. And then in the last couple of years, Richard Crossley has really put what he calls the Golden Triangle, which is basically the area around from Quail Lake up to Gorman and down toward Pyramid Lake. Of course, much of that burned recently, but again, you can see how migrants that are basically heading north in spring or northwest would funnel right through that area. So again, huge numbers of birds. So doesn't mean that every tree in every backyard in the Antelope Valley is going to have that many birds, but we're in a great area to see a good variety of migrants. So what I want to do is show you, so this is not going to be at all comprehensive, but I wanted to take a bunch of examples of birds where we may have a couple species here that look pretty similar, and show again how you want to factor in habitat and distribution. So for example, we have two thrashers, actually a couple more than that, but two expected thrashers in the Antelope Valley area, California and the LeConte. But if you look at the maps here from eBird, which is a big citizen science database that I assume many of you use, you can see just right at a glimpse that one basically is found in all the areas surrounding the Antelope Valley, but not so much in the valley itself. That's the California thrasher. Whereas the LeConte thrasher is a desert bird found primarily in the valley, but not in the surrounding upland areas. So that kind of guides you to where to go to look for these two, but it also means that it can contribute a lot to our understanding, because we're finding more and more places nowadays where California thrashers actually do kind of penetrate out into the Antelope Valley. So you see a few of the blue dots. The red dots just are more recent records, so those would be within the last month or so. But you can see there are records of California thrasher. I know I've seen them out at Lake Los Angeles. I've seen them at the ponds along the east side of the freeway, the Amargosa Basin up around Avenue H up there, and there's a record, a couple other scattered records farther out, and they do get into the Palmdale, Quartzville areas, and I see them on Big Rock Creek up where it crosses Palmdale Boulevard, or no, actually north of there where it crosses Avenue P, I think it is. So they do get out there, but they're not widespread through the valley, whereas LeConte is the one you expect through the valley, although it's scarce, hard to find, and they're hard to see unless they're up singing. And they also seem to be declining. Now, whether Californians are pushing them out, it's hard to say. I don't think so, but I think a lot of things like scraping of desert habitat, agricultural development, solar farms, things like that are not good news for LeConte thrashers. So how do you tell them apart? Well, California thrasher, again, it's more of a chaparral and woodland bird that just barely penetrates the edge of the desert. So it's a darker brown bird with a bit larger, with a longer beak, with very different calls than the LeConte, which is a very pale bird. This is a juvenile LeConte on the left, kind of the end of wing bars. But it looks very much like the adults, which would have maybe a slightly longer bill, maybe a darker tail, and not have those wing bars. But see, it's a much paler bird. If the picture of the California were better, you'd see kind of orangey under the tail, where it's just kind of buffy in the LeConte. And again, the habitat's pretty different. LeConte's like salt bush and creosote, scattered shrubs, and they'll sing from the top of a shrub, but they spend most of their time on the ground. And if you flush one, or if it sees you, it's not going to fly away. It's going to get on the ground and run like hell, and you're going to not see where it goes. So they're tough. So this is just an example of a species pair where, being in the Antelope Valley, you're in a great position to kind of compare where the two species occur. So here's another example. Very similar. The Nuttall's woodpecker is a woodland bird, oaks, riparian, conifers and oaks, mainly the coastal slope and mountains, and it's not really a desert bird. Whereas the ladderback woodpecker is a desert woodpecker, likes Joshua trees, other trees and woody shrubs in the desert habitats. So you can see that again right away from the two maps from eBird. But one thing you will notice is there's a lot of scattered records of Nuttall's woodpecker through the Antelope Valley. I think largely that's because of residential developments and ranch yards where trees are planted, and we've planted habitat that's better for Nuttall's than it would have been without having planted all those trees. So they've been able to colonize a few spots through the Antelope Valley, especially along the southern edge there. But what it does also is it brings them into contact with ladderback woodpeckers. And this complicates things for birders. They do hybridize. So I know where I live in Juniper Hills, which is kind of down at the bottom right of those maps, we see mostly ladderback, a fair number of Nuttall's, but a surprising number of hybrids as well. So we kind of look and sound, they look in between and they sound weird like either one of these parental species. So again, you can just compare the distributions of these. Now, these are males of both species. Nuttall's has the red a little more restricted, not coming as far forward on the crown. The ladderback has white spotting and barring right up to the top of the back, whereas Nuttall's has an area of, I guess I can use the cursor. Nuttall's has an area of black on the, I'm not going to use the cursor, but the upper back is an area of solid black. Ladderback has a slightly bigger bill. It's a little more spotty and a little more dingy underneath. That little white headlight at the base of the beak on the Nuttall's is dingier and more buffy in the ladderback. And the barring on the tail is a little bit different. So there are a lot of these characters, but as you will so often hear me say, they also sound very different. And the key to bird identification in most areas and most habitats is sound and listening to what they sound like. The nice thing about that is you don't have to see them, you can tell what they are without seeing them. But it's also, sometimes they're more distinct by voice than they are by appearance. So the ladderback gives just a sharp little pick call, a lot like a downy woodpecker. Whereas the Nuttall's is more of a burry and they have other vocalizations that also differ. So this is another species pair you can kind of have fun with in the Antelope Valley. Now these are more familiar birds, but it's sort of how do you tell a birder from a non-birder? A non-birder is the one that talks about all the crows in the Antelope Valley. Yeah, well, there are crows here, don't get me wrong, but the big black birds that are here, as you know, if you live here, are ravens, and they're absolutely everywhere. They're super abundant, and they can be soaring in huge flocks in the sky. They can be walking around parking lots eating trash. They can be eating baby tortoises. They're stealing bird eggs out of nests. And they're pretty much everywhere. But basically, common ravens are found in drier areas, desert, and also in mountain areas, in areas with a lot of relief. Whereas crows are more of a woodland bird of foothills and valleys. Ravens are even more common than crows up in the high mountains, as well as in the Antelope Valley, whereas crows are more common in residential areas, coastal slope woodlands, things like that. So you can see crows pretty much surround the Antelope Valley. But crows being crows, they have learned to survive in a lot of urban residential areas, including parts of Palmdale, Lancaster, Quartz Hill, and even smaller towns in the Antelope Valley. So even though ravens are the dominant one that's everywhere, crows have, and this is relatively recently, crows have colonized a lot of the residential and urban areas of the Antelope Valley. And I don't know, is there anyone here who sees crows pretty regularly?
We saw 5 on the way over here on my neighbor's, next door neighbor's lawn.
Okay, so they are around.
So the sod fields, the ravens and the crows are almost always over on the sod.
Yeah, but there's a lot of ravens there too.
Yeah, there are, but the crows are also there.
Yeah, no, they're pretty widespread, but they're just nowhere near as abundant as the ravens. And so you kind of wonder what Aldous Huxley was thinking when he wrote that children's book called what was it called? The Crows of Pear Blossom or something.
Yeah.
And I think his Corvid identification skills probably left him to be desired. Unless maybe there were crows back then, but the residential areas, the urban areas, and to some extent maybe the orchards as well have really favored crows, but again, only relatively speaking, it's mostly ravens.
Just the last few years, really.
Yeah, it's a relatively recent thing. So there would not have been crows around here at all back in the, say, 40s and 50s. Again, identification is pretty straightforward. If you see the two together, ravens are much, much bigger. But you often don't see them together. So crows have more rounded wings and more of a slightly rounded or almost squared off tail instead of that longer wedge-shaped tail. Ravens have more pointed wings. Ravens have a much deeper, larger bill. And again, they sound different. Crows have a higher pitched caw, ravens have those lower croaking noises. So they're pretty easy to tell apart. They don't hybridize, so you don't have to worry about cravens or All right, let's think of another example. So kingbirds. Kingbirds are pretty common flycatchers, yellow bellies, and we see a lot of western kingbirds in the Antelope Valley. But here I'm not only comparing geographical distribution, but also factoring in the time of year. So you can see that when they're here, which is basically it's spring through fall, rarely in November, mostly March to September, early October. Western kingbirds are very widespread through the Antelope Valley. They breed in ranch yards, desert areas, agricultural areas, towns. It's a very common bird. Whereas Cassin's kingbirds are very localized in the Antelope Valley. I've only seen them at Piute Ponds, I think, twice. In a few other areas, I've seen them in Little Rock with some regularity, but that may be at the edge of their regular range. But Cassin's is a much less common, much less expected bird in the Antelope Valley. Except, what if you're in the middle of winter? Western kingbirds are all in Mexico and Central America. And if you're going to see a kingbird, now these are year-round sightings of Cassin's. I didn't really tease apart how many were in winter, but a lot of the sightings in the Antelope Valley are in the wintertime. So if you see one of these yellow-bellied kingbirds in winter, it's going to be a Cassin's or something rare, and probably not a Western kingbird. So again, here we're factoring in status and distribution, time of year, and geography. And in terms of telling them apart, it's really hard to do with just a couple photos because different lighting and angles, they look very different. So, you know, for example, well, the Western kingbird is a paler bird. The throat and chest are pale whitish, blending into a light gray, and has clear white edges to the outer tail feathers. The Cassin's kingbird has a much darker chest and throat, with just a white chin and kind of that malar area at the base of the bill, contrasting with a darker throat. The tail is not quite as jet black as it is on a Western kingbird. It tends to have a thin tail tip, which can wear away, but when they're freshly molted, there's actually a fairly thick tail tip on the tail of the Cassin's. But they also have very pale edges to the outer part of the tail when they're in fresh plumage. Not that bright white edge of the Western, but enough of a pale edge that gets you thinking, oh, maybe it's a Western. It's got some light there. So you got to look pretty careful. Again, they sound totally different. Common call of a Western is just a sharp sort of beep, beep. And they have some other more squealing notes. Cassin's goes jabir, 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 jabir. So I'm going to go through several of these, and I'm also hopefully leaving time for people to ask me about their difficult identification issues that I don't get to. This isn't so much a comparison, even though I had mentioned California towhee before in the context of canyon towhee, which doesn't even occur in California. But again, this is one of these birds that's kind of all around the edge of the Antelope Valley, but not in the valley proper. I've seen them out in Lake Los Angeles, and I know there are scattered records. I've never seen one at Piute or Apollo or anywhere well out in the valley, but there are a tiny handful of records. These are non-migratory birds, so you don't expect them to just be moving through the valley, but young birds, probably dispersing birds, can wander out into the valley, but there are very few records. So if you're right on the edge again, Palmdale, Portville, Neenach, down up, well, Little Rock, Pear Blossom, those areas, you have towhees. When you get out into the flats of the valley, it's not a bird you expect to see. So even though it's a common bird, just think about it. If you see one out in the valley, make sure what it is and document it. So this is, it's just a
Well,
big...
we have them here, the Prime Desert.
Yeah, which is again unusual, or at least one of the few areas
Almost
where...
every single time.
Yeah, in fact, I should have mentioned that as one of the places where they do occur. It's, I don't know, is that red dot by the Outland Lancaster maybe?
Probably.
Yeah, so, but again, you're far enough south in the valley where you're getting toward where there are more records. But if you're way out in like the Salt Bush or Rosamond Lake or way out in the northeast part of the valley, you're really not very likely to see them. So easily identified, big fat brown sparrow. Really nothing much like it. The other towhees we have, which are actually in a different genus, the green-tailed and the spotted, look very, very different. So that you're not likely to confuse it. Other than the coloration, much like a California thrasher, but of course the beak is totally different. So here's another example of a bird that's kind of Antelope Valley adjacent, but you're not going to see one in the Antelope Valley. And this is the wren-tit, which is a chaparral bird. So you can go up along like Mount Emma Road towards Endless Forest Highway and see lots of wren-tits. You can go way up Big Rock Creek to where you get into Monte Chaparral. You'll find wren-tits.
You hear it more than you see them.
Well, yeah, you'll hear it. Distinctive song. It's a neat bird. I mean, its closest relatives are a group of babblers known as parrotbills that live in southern Eurasia and Southeast Asia and the Himalayas. So it's just totally in a different part of the world than its relatives. It's probably one of these many bird taxa that originally colonized the Americas over the Barren Land Bridge. I mean, we're in a very different climate, kind of the climate that we're headed toward pretty quickly right now too. So you can see again wren-tits all around the edges where there's chaparral, but no believable record from out in the Antelope Valley itself. And that's not too surprising since again these are really resident birds that don't move much. In fact, an adult wren-tit, once it's settled on a territory, which is probably not far from where it hatched, it's not going to move more than a few hundred meters its entire lifetime. And they probably mate for life, or at least for multiple years. So that pair will just not move. Now the young will disperse a little, but we're talking, a couple miles tops, really. They're not going to disperse way out into the northern Antelope Valley or something. So again, you got to factor in the dispersal abilities. So I don't have maps of these, but here's another Antelope Valley adjacent species on the left called the Hutton's vireo. And it's, again, a woodland bird and mostly likes oaks. So I have seen it once in Juniper Hills where I live, right along Fort Home Road. I've seen it, I think, once at maybe Lake Palmdale. And I've seen them up in Big Rock Creek, but that's up into the oaks, so they're probably resident there. But I've never seen one out in the floor of the Antelope Valley, although there are a few records because they will move a bit. So if you think you have a Hutton's vireo on the floor of the Antelope Valley, and it's between September and early April, think again, because it could very well be a ruby-crowned kinglet, the bird on the right, which is superficially very, very similar. In fact, in coloration, they're even more similar than these two photos look. So one's a vireo, it's a little more sluggish, it's got a slightly thicker bill and fatter legs. If you look at the legs of the vireo on the left, they're kind of chunky legs that are bluish-gray, whereas the kinglet on the right, kind of hard to tell from this photo, but the beak is very thin, the legs are very thin, but there's also a key difference in the wing pattern. Hutton's vireo has two clear wing bars on kind of a brownish hollow wing, whereas the ruby-crowned kinglet has one bold wing bar with a black patch behind it. Both of them are kind of frenetic, they flick the wings a lot, but especially the kinglet, which is my nickname for a ruby-crowned kinglet, is a neurosis with feathers. It's constantly shaking and moving and flipping and moving around like crazy. And the vireos do that to an extent too, but so here's a case where these two birds are not closely related at all, but they can be surprisingly hard to tell apart. And if you think you have a Hutton's vireo in a place where it shouldn't be, and consider it may very well be a ruby-crowned kinglet. I hardly have to say it again, but they sound totally different from one another too. Now on the other hand, if it's like July and you're in the floor of the Antelope Valley, I would say a Hutton's vireo is probably more likely than a ruby-crowned kinglet because they leave our area. They breed in forested areas farther north. Very few may breed in the San Gabriels, but they're very rare as breeders down here. So they all leave. You only expect to see them from September through April, basically, and that's it. So again, factor in season as well as locality. Now here's one that shouldn't be too tough because we've got lots and lots of California scrub jays, even though again they're not really out on the floor of the valley much. And we have a whopping total of I think 3 county records of woodhouse scrub jay, which is a Great Basin sister species to the California scrub jay, or closely related species. There's another related species, as we know, out on Santa Cruz Island, in addition. But again, look at the map for California scrub jay. They're abundant wherever there's woodland and chaparral and oaks all around the edge of the valley, and then just scattered records through the valley. Again, they're out at Quartz Hill, there's South Palmdale, some areas. I don't know, do you see them here on the preserve? I guess
Got them in our
that's-
yard.
We've seen
Have we
this.
seen this rotate here?
Yeah.
Okay, well,
California spread.
yeah, okay, so that's one of the areas they get out to. And in fact, you can probably see the ducks. So they'll get into Lancaster. I saw one in Lancaster, the city park, the one park, last year, I think it was. So they'll get out here, but they're really not all through the floor of the valley. You don't expect them out of the creosote scrub or the saltbush or a Piute. I think there's one record for Piute Ponds. Whereas Woodhouse and Scrub Day, the records that there are, one was at Joseph and Jerry Dunn's residential area out in, what is that, like
Warren.
100th east? No, it's northeast, east of Lancaster, like G8 and 100th or something like that. Yeah, kind of, roughly that area. They had one that they photo documented, and then John Feenstra doing surveys on the Edwards Air Force bases have them now at least twice in the little mesquite woodland right on the county border near Branch Memorial Park there and the pond. It's just into Kern County, but the mesquites come into LA County. So he's had Woodhouse and Scrub Day, including one this year a couple times. He's also had whitetail gnatcatcher there a couple times. So right at the edge of the county. So this is, on the other hand, if you do see a jay out in the middle of the desert, out in the Antelope Valley, you want to look at it carefully, especially between, say, September and March, when woodhouses, which nest farther north and east in the Great Basin, when they might wander into this area. They don't look that different. The woodhouses on the right is a little more of a bland bird. The blue is not as deep. The throat and chest are a little more washed out and gray. Those blue patches on the sides of the chest are not very distinct. The beak is a little thinner, and they sound a little different. But you'd really have to document it, because they're not that different in the California scrub jays. But that's one that is going to show up somewhere in the Antelope Valley again sometime. So this is sort of fun with subspecies. You know, bell sparrows, which we used to call sage sparrows, so they were split, are very common through the Antelope Valley. They nest in the saltbush, to some extent in creosote and other low desert scrub habitats. So this is a map of canescence bell sparrows. This is, I think, just in the breeding season, the map that I'm showing. They're all through the Antelope Valley in low desert scrub. They will disperse a little bit, especially higher up into the mountains after breeding. Like we get them in Juniper Hills, we're at 3,600 feet, and we get them starting in May or June every year, young birds and post-breeding dispersing adults. But you have to go a few miles below us to get to the breeding sites. But then there's two subspecies of bells in the area, and the darker coastal subspecies, which is Artemisia spiza belli, as opposed to Artemisia spiza belli canescens, which is the Mojave bell sparrow in the map above. But the darker nominate belli are Chemise chaparral. So you can see them as close as like the Angeles Forest Highway. You go up to, take Mount Emma to Angeles Forest. Once you get to there, it's Chemise chaparral. From there up to the summits and down Aliso Canyon, you'll see the darker bell sparrows there. So it's really interesting because they breed in the Palmdale area, Vincent Palmdale area. They probably breed within 2 or 3 miles of each other, but in different habitats. And it'd be really interesting to know how they behave where they overlap, because we've recently split out another species from this group, which we now call the sagebrush sparrow, which is a Great Basin bird, which occurs here probably uncommonly but regularly in winter, though it's so hard to identify. We don't really know their status that well. But the bells and the canescens, the coastal bells and the Mojave canescens, occur very close to one another. But again, I've never seen one of these dark bell sparrows on the lower map out into the Antelope Valley, nor would I expect it, because they don't move much. So Here's the Canescens, the one we see all through the Antelope Valley on the left here. It's a fairly pale bird. And if you look at Andy Birch's painting here on the right, the Canescens is up top there, and then the darker bells, which is in the chemise chaparral, is on the bottom. So it's darker above, darker gray head, darker brown back, much thicker black mailer stripe on the edge of the throat, and a slightly different song. So they're not that different, but you can tell them apart. And then in the middle is this other species, now considered another species, the sage brush sparrow with a streaky back that we get here in the wintertime. But again, uncommonly, as far as we know, but they're so hard to tell apart. It's really hard to be certain. It's a really interesting group of birds, and we're just right at that nexus here in the Antelope Valley where the different forms occur together. So one thing to keep in mind is a lot of the water birds that you may see commonly on the coast are much scarcer inland and in the Antelope Valley. So for example, among shorebirds, we've got some good shorebird habitat, especially in Piute Ponds, and we get good numbers of a great variety of shorebirds coming through. But some that you see commonly on the coast, like ruddy turnstone, black turnstone, and sanderling, are very rare out here in the Antelope Valley. We see them, they've all been seen at Piute, but quite rarely. Surfbird is another example of coastal bird, and just a couple records out here. So keep in mind that if you see some of these things, remember you're inland, you're not on the coast where they normally occur. So scoters, for example, these diving ducks, are very common in the coastal marine waters and bays, but scarce out here. We see all three species have been found, but we get surf scoter with some regularity on the deeper reservoirs, but they're quite scarce out here. We've got a few records of white-winged too. Again, eared grebe, very common out here. They nest at Piute, they're on all the reservoirs, they're in the aqueducts and so on. But the horned grebe is much scarcer. They occur here. You'll see them regularly on Lake Palmdale, Quail Lake, Apollo Lake sometimes, but they're just much smaller numbers than they would be on the coast. So if you see one of these two grebes, it's far more likely you're going to see an eared grebe out here, although horned grebes do occur. Likewise, the loons. The common loon we see from time to time on deep water here, like Lake Palmdale and places like that. And it's pretty regular, but the other two loons, red-throated and Pacific, or the other two that are common on the coast, are really rare out here. We get Pacific loons, maybe one almost every year. Lake, again, deep water lakes like Lake Palmdale or Quail Lake. Red-throated even scarcer than that. So just remember for water birds that a lot of species have a very different status inland than they do on the coast. Hummingbirds are always fun. This is our feeder dominated in summer. They're really dominated by costas, although you can see at least a couple annas way over on the right side, those darker, bigger ones. But they're always a challenge. But again, there are some regular patterns of occurrence. So the adult males are pretty easy. Annas, of course, are common year-round here, although I think at least in summer and in some desert habitats, they're definitely outnumbered by costas. Again, at our house, we get annas is the most common one in winter, and we get very few costas. It's starting in spring through summer, we get lots of costas and seemingly fewer annas. Black chins is a summer bird here, late spring and summer. They'll arrive in April. They'll be around through September, and then they're gone, so you won't see them at all in winter. And that's in the lower left, and it's a poor lighting, but you can see that black. Now, if it were to turn in good light, you'd see a violet band on the lower part of the gorget of the throat. But just the shape of the throat patch is very different, really neatly cut off. The other thing about black chin, one of which you can see in this photo, is the tail is doubly forked. So there's a notch in the tail. It's two sharp, pointy forked tail. And you can even see that to a slight extent on females, but in the males it's very distinctive, that double point of the tail. You can't see it on this photo, but the inner primaries, in a hummingbird, the secondaries are really short. You barely see them, just a little stack of feathers up by the wrist. The primaries are all spaced out going out the wing. The inner ones, like 1 through 6 or so, are very narrow in black chins, and then they get wider as you go out. By the time you get to the outermost one, primary number 10, it's quite broad and rounded. Whereas in like the Annas and Costas, they're pretty much even with all the way out, primary 1 through 9. It's a subtle thing, but if you ever get a chance to closely study hummingbirds, it's really helpful. So all three of these you might see around right now. Black chins they like deciduous trees, so they're along the creeks. They're in parks with a lot of shade trees planted, and probably a lot of residential areas too. Rufous hummingbird is a migrant through here in spring. The adult males can have variable amounts of green on the back, but a typical one is all rufous above. And then Allen's is an interesting bird because we didn't used to have them out here at all other than as a really scarce migrant. And those would be migrants to the populations that nest on the immediate coast from about Humboldt County down to San Luis Obispo County, not inland, but some of them would migrate through the Antelope Valley, but probably very rarely. But Allen's have spread like crazy all through the urban coastal slope of Southern California, including now they've made headway out into the Quartz Hill, Palmdale area. And so and then Mickey, you've had them all the way up Rosamond, right?
Yeah.
So they have moved out here, but
Yeah, residents in our area.
yeah, and they breed out here. The Rufous don't breed south of basically the California-Oregon border. If you get a breeding Rufous or Allen's here, it's going to be an Allen. But that's a recent thing. I'm guessing probably within certainly the last 20 years, and maybe mostly the last 10 years or so.
So then aggressive too.
Oh yeah, really aggressive. So they're getting more common out here, but again, they haven't spread out into desert habitats. They're relying on exotic plantings and flowering plants and feeders. Now the females are a little more subtle. And I'm not going to walk through all the ID characters of the females, but needless to say, now Rufous and Allen's both sound and look almost identical. I don't try and identify the females unless I get a great study of the tail feathers, and they sound identical to mine here. But Costas, Blackchin, and Annas are pretty easily told apart again if you know what to look for. So Costas is very clean underneath, pale whitish gray with no markings really, the females. Now a young male will have some patches of violet on the throat, but a female is very plain. The other thing about Costas is the bill is shorter. If you look at the Blackchin over to the right, it's got a longer bill. Costas has a shorter bill. Costas has a pale line over the eye that wraps all the way around kind of behind that grayish ear patch. Whereas in Blackchin, it tends to be a white spot behind the eye, but not that pale long line that surrounds the ear patch. The shape of the primary feathers on the wing hold up for females as well as males. Blackchins have a longer tail that they pump like crazy when they're flying. Costas will pump the tail too, but not as much. So again, there's subtle differences. Anna's is a dingier bird. A lot of kind of gray mottling on the sides, or even greenish gray. The throat is dingier. It's a bigger bird than the other two, especially bigger than the Costas if you see them together. And again, these three all sound very different from one another. Costas has very light, a little bit like bush jay sound, and then some sputtering noises. Blackchins give a squeaky call, a keep. It's a different kind of sputtering. And Annas have a variety of calls, but mostly kind of a jumbo like tick sort of call. So yeah, the nice thing about hummingbirds, you put out feeders and you get a really nice chance to study them. So it's subtle and difficult, but it's doable. Here's a bird that's widespread through the Antelope Valley. I'm only showing it because, again, it's more in the valley and not once you get outside of the valley. So you're not going to see it up in the mountains. It's very rare on the coastal slope. But birds are pretty widespread through creosote scrub and Joshua tree woodland through much of the Antelope Valley. They're not so common in the really low salt bush areas of like Piute Ponds, which is a pretty scarce bird. They occur because they're scarce. But anywhere where there's a lot of creosote and Joshua, including right here, you're going to see birds. But worldwide, it's an interesting bird because you see it's mapped there in southwestern U.S. and Mexico. All of its relatives in the same family are the rest of that range in Africa and southern Europe, east into Asia. So this, like the wren-tit, this is another bird that probably colonized the New World through the Bering Strait, back in warm epochs when there was habitat going all the way across. Not the bird itself, but its progenitors or ancestors. Pdwp is another really interesting, easy to identify, there's no question about that. But it's interesting just in terms of its distribution because it does a lot of different things here. It's famous for nesting early in the spring, late winter, early spring on the low deserts, like the Colorado Desert. And then when those birds are through nesting, many of them migrate northwest to coastal regions and nest again in May and June and July. So the same individuals will nest in two different areas separated by sometimes 200-300 miles or more in the same year. So we get that movement in spring of Pdwp moving west through here. But they also like berries and especially mistletoe. So wherever you have mistletoe, like in the sycamores or the conifers and oaks up Big Rock Creek and various other areas, Guillermo, you're going to have Pdwp even all through the winter, whenever the mistletoe is producing berries. And this is how mistletoe gets from one tree to another. Pdwp can digest mistletoe berry in something like 20 minutes from going in the mouth to coming out the other end. And they secrete the sticky part around the seed and just digest the, I don't know, it's the mesocarp or exocarp or whatever it's called around the berry. So the sticky part comes out of their droppings and sticks to a branch, and voila, you get more mistletoe. So, and then they also, in the warmer months of the year, do a lot of seeding, fly catching on aerial insects. So you see them in warm areas doing a lot of fly catching. So you can see them any month of the year here, but they're kind of different, doing different things at different times of the year. I've just got a few more examples, and then I'll let you all off the hook. We don't have to have like a bottle or glass of water or something here, Carol.
Let me see if I can find some.
I don't know, if I lose my voice, you'll probably all benefit from it. If you don't worry about it. So song sparrow is a really interesting bird. It's actually not a very common bird in the Antelope Valley because they like wetlands and marshes and stream bottoms with a lot of brush and all that. Oh, perfect, thank you. Just tell me where to put my dollar. Nice. So they're not a desert bird. Much better. He was a presidential candidate. He took a big long sip of water and he got canned for debate performance.
He's got to hold it with 2 hands.
Is that it? Anyway, we're not going to talk about it. So a song sparrow is a breed here, and they're very common at Piute Ponds because that's good habitat here. They're along Big Rock Creek and Little Rock Creek, and basically riparian areas where there's surface water or at least moist areas with a lot of brush. And they're going to look like the one on the left with a lot of black streaking below. But when I see song sparrows out in the middle of the Antelope Valley, they're usually migrants or wintering birds that are coming from elsewhere. So the bird on the right was photographed, I believe that one was photographed at, well, I don't know if this particular photo was, but I've seen a bird just like this at Lake Palmdale with kind of reddish halos or backgrounds on the streaking below. And that's a subspecies that nests much farther north and inland, like interior northwestern U.S. in that area, maybe Montana or one of those subspecies. So we get migrant song sparrows along with the resident ones that are here in the riparian and the marshy areas. But it's not a bird you're going to see widely through the Antelope Valley, but if you do, it pays to really look at them because there's a lot of geographical variation in song sparrows. You get some different subspecies. Some of the northwestern subspecies are very dark, ruddy brown, and they would stick out like a sore thumb here, and they could occur. By the time you get out in the Aleutian Islands, they're the size of California toads, like dark gray-brown. And yet they sound just like song sparrows everywhere, no matter what they look like. Another thing about song sparrows is, and this is a common mistake a lot of new birders make, perfectly understandable, is that's a juvenile song sparrow on the left. And it looks quite different to the adults. Very, hardly any streaking below, much buffier. And they often get mistaken for the bird on the right, which is a Lincoln sparrow, a close relative of the song sparrow, with fine streaking, much buffier bird. The Lincolns are here in the fall and winter, so they'll arrive in September, they'll be around through March into early and April, and then they're gone. They breed farther north primarily. So if you see in summer, you think you see a Lincoln sparrow, late spring or summer, it's much more likely it's a juvenile song sparrow. And the best way to tell is just watch who feeds it. I mean, in other words, wherever you see a juvenile song sparrow, you're going to see some adults too. Now, I must say Lincoln sparrows do actually breed not far from the Antelope Valley. There's almost every year a breeding pair up around Big Pines, so the Big Pines intersection, the meadow there by the ski resort. So that's one of the very few breeding areas for Lincoln sparrows in Southern California. But there's one or two pairs, so it's not a bird you can see down here in the summer. And then I just thought I'd finish with everybody's favorite.
State bird of Utah.
The California gull is. This is not
No.
the California gull. Yes, you're right. The state bird of Utah is the California gull. So this is the western gull. It's really dark. You can't tell it has a dark back and mantle because you're looking at the bottom of the bird. But one clue is see now that dark coming in on the flight feathers? Now it's edged in white, so the rear edge of the wing is white. But just inside of that, those are the primaries and secondaries. And then in front of that on the wing, that's all covered up by the white underwing covers. But that dark band, when it looks that dark on a gull, it means that the upper part, the upper wing is going to be really dark. And that's actually useful in telling California from ring-billed gulls too, because California gulls are medium gray above, not nearly this dark, but medium gray. And ring-bills are very light gray above. So on a California gull, you're going to see a hint of this on the secondaries coming in toward the body along the wing. It's not going to be that dark, but it's going to be obviously gray and contrasty with the white edge and the white covers in front of it. Whereas a ring-billed gull is so pale that it basically looks uniformly white underneath going in toward the body. Now the outer primaries have a lot of black in all these species, but the secondaries and innermost primaries are going to be, you know, kind of dark slaty in the western, kind of grayish in California, but very pale and whitish in ring-bill. But what confuses people most about gulls are the various immature stages. So I'm not going to go through them, but just keep in mind that California gull is the dominant gull in the Antelope Valley. Around the garbage dumps, around the parks and lakes, Piute Ponds, almost anywhere. Common in winter, common migrant. But we do get ring-billed gulls. And ring-bills, you go to Apollo Lake, there's going to be some ring-billed gulls there. Very few in summer, but in winter migration there'll be a few. Sometimes as many as there are Californians. But by and large, the common big gull flocks in the Antelope Valley are California gulls. Now the western gull I showed in the previous slide is a very rare bird. I've seen exactly one ever in the Antelope Valley. There are just a couple of other records, so it just doesn't come inland from the coastal slope much at all. Now there are rare, like herring gulls are regular but uncommon. There are records of lesser blackback gulls, moccasin gulls, a few others, but California and ring-bill are the default gulls out there, and especially California. So these are immature birds, like roughly 1-year-old birds, California's above. They have longer beaks than the ring-bill gulls. They're slightly bigger overall. And they just tend to be muddier looking, brownish gray, mottly. Ring-bills are much cleaner underneath, so that's a young one on the lower left there. And that, they don't get much browner and more mottly than that, except maybe the young juvenile. So, and then, again, the one on the right is a year older than that, so it's looking more like an adult, but it's got a much shorter bill than a California, And by that age, it's starting to get the pale eye of an adult ring-billed gull. California gulls always have dark eyes. Now, but one caution is there, although these two Californias on top don't really show it, but they go through a stage where they have a black ring on the bill. So there'll be a little bit of pale at the tip, pale base with a black ring. A black ring on the bill does not a ring-billed gull make necessarily. Just keep that in mind. That's just one of many, many ways that gulls are confusing. Another way they're confusing is they hybridize with one another like crazy. Not these two, but there are many, many hybrid combinations. And you'll know ring-billed Californias don't hybridize. Or if they have, it's super duper rare. But again, just remember to learn California gull and all of its plumages from juvenile to adult, because that's the default common gull out here. Then learn ring-bill, because there are plenty of those as well. And then everything else is a bonus, pretty much. And I could go on and on, but this is my way of promising you that I won't. But I thought we could at least close on analyzing what this bird is, and then maybe leave some time for some questions and comments. It's a flycatcher.
Whether it's an olive or whether it's
Well, this is not really fair. This is this genus in Pdwp, so small flycatchers that are notoriously difficult, except they're much less difficult than the guys that have you believe, partly because, again, they all sound different. So this bird, the first thing you want to know is what does its call note sound like? Not the song, because a lot of these that migrate through here aren't singing, although they will sing in migration, but there's this single call note that these all give. So in a western flycatcher, or until recently known as also Pacific slow flycatcher, it's a sharp rising whistle. It's really distinctive, a high rising whistle call, or just a very high pitched seep call. Hammond's flycatcher gives a peep. Sounds like a pygmy nuthatch. If you ever hear pygmy nuthatches going peep, 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 Hammond's just gives a single peep. That was very different from Dusky, which gives a whit. It's a sharp little W-I-T, whit. And gray flycatcher gives an almost identical whit. This species also gives a call like a whit, but it's a little more liquid, a little richer, more of a whit, whit. And this is a willow flycatcher. So it's a common spring migrant, but they don't arrive until about the second week of May. And they're still migrating through as late as the third week of June, even as late as about the 20th, 25th of June sometimes. So they're super late spring migrant. I'm not going to go through all the other species, but things you look for are the call note, how much of an eye ring they have. Willows have a very indistinct eye ring, if at all, whereas the others all have a much more distinct eye ring. The color of the beak and the size of the beak. Willows have a relatively long, large beak with a lot of orange underneath. At the other extreme, Hammond's flycatcher has a very small, very dark beak. Also what we call primary extension. So you see on the wing, let me see if I can, you see the wing here, you see these three pale edges? Those, oops, what did I do? Well, it's okay. It's the last slide anyway. Those are the tertials, which are way in toward the body, and then the things sticking out beyond them are the primaries, the longest outer flight feathers. All the other feathers are hidden underneath. In a willow flycatcher, the primaries stick out relatively short distance from the tertials. In some species, like the Hammonds, there's much more wing projection beyond the tertials, much longer primary. So it's subtle things like that you look at. General overall color, but this is, if you master this group, then you're top-notch birder. And even the best birders I know are very, very willing to let a lot of these go unidentified, especially if they're not making any noise. And that's what I got to say. So, any questions, comments? Particular identification issues of your own? Or no comments? I covered everything.
Cass's in purple.
Well, in an Antelope Valley context, purple finch is a very rare bird. Cass's is is also rare, but they tend to wander, especially late winter, early spring, through the foothills and occasionally out into the parks in the Antelope Valley. They like to eat buds of trees that are just beginning to bud out. And so Cassins is actually probably more likely, even though we think of it as a more of a high elevation bird than even purple finch. It's probably more likely out in the middle of the Antelope Valley than purple finch. And of course, house finch is the other bird in that group, that genus. They're everywhere. So, but yeah, it's basically bill-shaped, Cassins being very conical, very straight upper ridge, they call it a beak. Purple is a little more curved. Cassins is the females are a little paler above, so the streaking is sharper and more obvious, whereas purple is a little more washed out. The adult males are different in how pink and red they are. The brightest part of the Cassins finch is the cap, whereas the rest is more pink, whereas purples are more uniformly washed. And they sound different. Although they do have a lot of calls that are pretty similar. The songs are pretty similar, but Cassins is a lot flutier. It's actually a much prettier song than the purple finch. The call notes, purples give a sharp little pick call in flight, and Cassins have a squeaky, usually two-note, I don't even know, cedic or something like that. Like a squeaky two-note call usually.
Merlin sound pretty good at distinguishing.
I've never used Merlin, so I don't know. Merlin's pretty good at distinguishing most things, but Merlin gets tripped up a lot. If you use Merlin when you're doing eBird, make sure eBird knows your location. Otherwise, Merlin's going to use every bird in the world to compare with, and it's going to come up with some really big odds. Also, if your bird is identified only by Merlin, I would treat that somewhat skeptically. Or at least if it's based on a recording, I would put the recording in your eBird list so it can be verified. Yes?
There are some bluebirds, blue-colored birds that come through in the area of probably the
Well, you could well be seeing mountain bluebirds, which come in big numbers, variable from year to year, but they love fruit eaters, and what they love more than anything else are the Chinese pistache trees that are planted in every shopping mall in the Antelope Valley. You'll see them swarming into these pistache trees, eating the little red berries off them. So a lot of the parks and shopping malls here have them.
What if there are specific trees that line in a street in my neighborhood, and they're always one of those trees?
It sounds like that. Now they'll also get out like in the alfalfa fields eating insects. They'll be out on the sod farms. It can be very widespread. But they don't, despite the name mountain bluebird, they don't nest in our mountains. They come from farther north, like the Great Basin. Now we also have western bluebirds here, which is more of a woodland bird that you see in the foothills.
You don't have that little long tail?
No, they're kind of chunky thrush shaped.
So the birds that come are very big, and they don't have that kind of jade.
Well, no, they're smaller than this, with a shorter tail. The males are beautiful, like bright sky blue. The females are more of a grayish blue. So I bet you're seeing mountain bluebirds. It's a great area for them. And they're wintertime, basically, so October to March, basically. Yes, Ruth?
With kingbirds, we used to have nothing but western where I am, and now it's all Cassins. Would the Cassins have pushed out the westerns, do you think?
Possibly. Cassins have expanded their range. They're definitely more common and found in more areas than they used to be. And that's true with much of California, not just here. And I've seen more Cassins here than I ever used to. But whether there's a cause and effect is hard to know. Cassins like lots of big trees. Westerns can get by with fewer trees, more arid, more open areas. So the fact that we planted so many trees is probably like, even eucalyptus, non-native things, just Cassins like these big trees. So yeah, it's possible that they are very pugnacious. Of course, all kingbirds are. So you would think a western could hold its own against a Cassin, but we'll have
And they're the
to
same size.
put two in a cage and see how they do.
Definitely not bluebirds.
Okay, good.
There you go.
Good. Beautiful bird. State bird of Idaho, is it? Yes,
There are a lot of eagles around, maybe? Bald eagles?
there's not a lot of eagles anywhere.
Golden
Bald eagles, well, we have bald and golden eagles. Golden eagles are kind of they're very scarce, but they're in all the mountains ringing the Antelope Valley. And in the wintertime, you'll see them out in the floor of the valley. Agricultural areas, Piute Ponds, even some of the desert stuff. But very few. I consider it lucky if I see one golden eagle in a day if I'm driving around, birding around in winter. Bald eagles like water. So I see them on the aqueduct, I see them at Lake Palmdale, I see them at Piute Ponds, Quail Lake.
Big bear.
So they're not a lot of them, but you have a good chance of seeing one if you're near a lake or a reservoir, or even sometimes along the aqueduct. They don't nest here. Golden eagles will nest in the more rugged mountains around the Antelope Valley, maybe even rarely out on the buttes or something. But
Do they stay in pairs, golden eagles?
no,
No, it's out there.
no, we usually see them singly. Yes.
Yeah, I have a bird that I'm having a hard time identifying. The only time I see it is it's flying low into the bottom branch of the bush. So I'm only seeing the top part. And I don't see anything in bird guides that show that part. And it's like it has a white band across the tail feathers, and it's sort of rounded. It's mostly white back. But it just quickly disappears. And I have no idea how I can match that. Just
We need a field guide with quickly disappearing birds. That's how wide in the tail.
How big is it?
Boy, would
Yeah.
that be great.
Is it
It's mostly gray and white. I see the spring white, and it has a fanned out tail with the edges is white, and then the back is white.
Back in mockingbirds, they're gray. They flash a lot of white in the wing and the tail.
That's
Cactus wrens have kind of a white edge all around.
well, I see a lot of them now.
How big is
Hard to
it?
say.
How big is it? Is it sparrows out or wrong?
It's a little bit.
Size of a gym?
And what's the habitat? Is it residential? Or?
Oh, it's by satellite view.
Oh, I would have-
There's pine trees. It likes to go in the fir tree.
Spotted toadies migrate through there. They show a lot of white in the corner, but they're dark. They're very dark.
But the problem is no bird guide wants to show it can fly from
I guess we're
above.
not used to looking down.
That is true.
So maybe we need a field guide from the birds from on high.
I don't know, it'd be cool to see.
Yeah, I wish I could get a picture of it. Yeah.
So I have a family of little black phoebes in my backyard because I have a big fish pond and, they're really cute. But then there's another one that's brown, but they look almost exactly like the black phoebe, but it doesn't have quite as much of a crest.
Sounds like a sage phoebe. That's
Okay.
the other phoebe we have, which is kind of a grayish brown above.
Yeah.
A bit more of a salmony color underneath. They do the same thing with the tail,
Yeah.
the black tail that they wave around. They sound very different. Black phoebes have that sharp chip call that they give. Sage give a whistle.
Okay.
Lips are dried
Yeah,
up.
I wasn't sure if it was like a female or if it was a completely different.
No, male and female black phoebes essentially look identical.
Okay.
So it sounds like a sage phoebe. They'll do the same thing. They'll nest like on ledges under buildings and things.
Okay.
And they're actually more widespread than black phoebes are in the Antelope Valley. Black phoebes usually like some kind of water nearby,
Yeah.
like your pond.
I love it.
Yeah, I bet it's a sage phoebe.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I saw the zombie buttons recently.
Uh-huh.
I think in
Yeah.
San Francisco.
Yeah.
Is it possible to also have indigo buttons in the same area?
Yes, it's possible.
Okay, because I just saw it's more rare than the
It's
zombie.
much more rare.
Okay, because I
We
wasn't
get-
sure.
Every year there may be a couple of indigo bunnies people find
Yeah.
spring and summer.
Yeah.
But they're deep, entirely deep blue.
Yeah, I didn't see any white whatsoever.
could well be San Francisco.
I didn't report it because it's saying I don't report it. I'm like, I'm trying to do it on
Well,
that.
Blue Grove Peaks are also completely deep blue too, but they've got sort of a chestnut patch on the wing, and they're much bigger. So it could well be, you know.
It could be.
Oh, how do I get out of this? I don't know Max.
I know, Max over here.
Anyway, I'll take my thumb drive out once I figure out how to close it. I'm a PC person.
So for, like, example, the vermilion flycatcher you mentioned earlier, I've seen two males since I've been here, very extreme differences in color, like they were vastly different. But how would you, if you did find a female, I guess you just have to see them together, because the one you showed up there was...
Well, that was a particularly difficult one, the streaky juvenile.
Yeah.
The females have enough, either kind of pale orangey yellow down on the belly,
This is
or even almost pinkish.
Okay, so I guess you could
And
see
they
it.
have that eyelash.
Yeah, they have a light
It's very-
streak over the eye.
And they're just delicate.
They're small and short tailed. They're kind of like if you took a phoebe and shrunk it a little and squished it in a little bit.
There's a,
And where there's a female, there's often a male somewhere around. The males just, you know, they glow. You can't
And there's-
tell
do the females make that little sound, or is that just the males?
Yeah, the sharp.
No, the song.
Oh, I think
males
those
are
males do
yeah,
that sputtering song that they'll give in flight. Only the males do that as far as I know.
Will they stay in an area very long if there's no females, or do they move? Because like Carol and I went out to go see one that I'd seen 3 previous trips and wasn't there that time.
They move around a lot.
So
They seem to have little ephemeral populations that just move. Like they nested at Pear Blossom Park 3 or 4 years ago, and I haven't seen them there since. They've nested at Piute Ponds, but some years they're not there at all.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's weird. There are very few totally consistent places for vermilion flycatchers out here, even though in the course of a year you're going to run into
Yeah,
them.
because I've pretty much gone on eBird on every place they saw them. Finally found them in 2 spots, but you don't see them routinely every trip
Yeah.
at all.
Yeah, it's a weird bird. They just move around a
They're
lot.
so pretty though. I've really enjoyed
The
them.
Rancho Sierra Golf Course is another place.
Yeah, that's where I finally saw the wolf
Oh, okay.
one. Yeah.
Except I don't know how much longer they'll be there.
It wasn't there.
They stopped watering
Yeah.
until the trees are dying. Yes.
I haven't been seeing a lot of red-tailed hawks lately. Are they in decline now, or
Not really.
because I used to see a lot more of them years ago?
Their populations are doing pretty well. Now, we do get a lot that come in the winter, so you're going to see fewer at this time of year no matter what anyway.
Oh, okay.
But, no, I think they're doing quite well, so you're just
Good.
and unlucky. Yeah.
So I work at Edwards, and when I go to work, I do it with Southgate on Avenue East in one point. I look at the power poles all the time, and I see hawks on there. I'll see a really, really white one without like a belly band. Could it be a Swainson's?
Yes, it could. Swainson's should have a distinctly dark chest of pale morphs.
Okay.
Of course, in the winter, Perugian hawks are there, and they're very white all underneath, but they wouldn't be there this time of year.
Okay.
So, and red tails are super variable, but yeah, the juveniles that can be very white on the breast tend to have a lot of blackish streaking across the belly. So hard to say, but I mean, I know the line of poles you're talking about. I see red tails all the time. But Swainson's move through in pretty good numbers in the early March and April. There are a few here through the summer. There's a few breeding pairs. You wouldn't expect them in winter, but this time of year it's pretty much going to be all red tails.
What time of year do you see it?
I think this is like winter into spring. That's all.
I wish I could go through that gate to get to Piute. Several miles. We used to back in the 80s. That's how we just drive in before it
I
was.
haven't been there before. I didn't even know it existed.
Oh, yeah.
Paiute's awesome. You gotta go.
Yeah, it used to be wide open before the Air Force Base was for an Air Force base. Maybe we should have all these people go on board.
Is the only way to get there by driving down that shuttle road from Roosevelt?
If you've got an annual pass,
We'll give you the
they'll give you the combination to the gate on Avenue C.
That's the quicker way, because Division Street's long and bumpy. Yeah. But
Yeah.
you can use Charlie.
If you
it's
just
easier.
if you just get a day pass, you'd have to come down the shuttle road from Rosemont bribe somebody to give you the combination of the gate, but we're sworn not to give it to them.
Because I have base access, and she just said, oh, if you have base access, the only way you can do it is down the shuttle road. And I drove down that one time, and it took me so long, it was so bumpy.
It's about 5 miles.
Yeah, it's
6 miles probably.
not that bad, but.
It can be.
If you're, I mean, if you're on base already, just do the, just get with Misty and get the pass, like, do the little training thing or whatever, and then go.
Well, anyway, thank you for your attention. I know it's kind of a hodgepodge of stuff, but I hope it gets you thinking about bird ID a little differently, and also just how lucky you are to be in this area with such a great combination of habitats and birds. So enjoy it.
Thank you.